We were sitting around the dinner table in Chandler, Arizona, when my father Richard stood up. Acting like a judge reading a final verdict, he announced he was gifting my apartment to my newlywed sister Chloe and her husband Greg. He gave me 1 week to pack up and leave. Chloe practically glowed with greed. She laughed, passing around expensive blueprints for my living room, and told me to find a cheap motel. I did not scream or cry. I just took a slow sip of my iced tea. Then I reached into my bag and slid a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside was the official real estate deed to the entire apartment building, proving I owned every single brick. Before I show you the legal eviction notice, I handed them next please like and subscribe to my channel. Drop a comment below with your age and let me know where you are listening from. But my story did not start with a flawless victory. My name is Emily Lewisa. I am 34 years old and I work as a medical underwriter. My job is to look at risk, assess the numbers, and determine the cold, hard facts. I should have applied that same logic to my family. Let me take you back 4 years to the day I made a quiet financial mistake born out of daughterly guilt. My parents, Richard and Susan, had always lived beyond their means. They financed cars they could not afford and took vacations on credit cards to keep up appearances in our suburban neighborhood. The math finally caught up with them when I was 30. They declared bankruptcy and were facing immediate eviction from the 6-unit complex they had rented in for a decade. Chloe was away at college, living on my parents' dwindling dime. When she graduated high school, my parents rented a white stretch limousine and hosted a catered backyard party. 4 years earlier, my own college degree earned me a single text message and a frozen supermarket cake. Her life was a series of heavily funded celebrations, while my steady, reliable paycheck was simply expected. When the eviction notice arrived, my mother wept, and my father refused to look me in the eye. I could not let them be thrown out onto the street. So I liquidated my savings accounts, cashed out my stock options, and quietly purchased the entire 6-unit building under a limited liability company. To protect my father's pride, I made a quiet legal error. I did not tell Chloe or the rest of our extended family that I was the landlord. I legally appointed my father as the property manager. I gave him the authority to collect rents, handle maintenance requests, and sign leases, while I quietly paid the mortgage behind the scenes. I thought I was keeping the peace. I thought I was being a good daughter by letting him retain his dignity as the head of the household. Instead, I handed a man who always favored his youngest daughter the legal authority to destroy my life. For 4 years I lived in unit number 3. I paid my own rent into the maintenance account to keep the books clean. I watched my parents slowly regain their footing. But gratitude is a temporary condition. As Chloe approached graduation and then her engagement, my parents' old habits returned. They needed money for a lavish wedding. They needed space for their expanding favored family. To them, I was just the single childless sister taking up square footage that Chloe could use. My father began treating the building not as a lifeline I had thrown him, but as his personal asset. He forgot who held the mortgage. Which brings us back to that Sunday dinner. The moment he handed me a typed letter telling me to vacate the premises by the end of the month, believing he held all the cards. Dropping a deed on a dining table only works in movies. In reality, the room did not fall silent in awe. My father looked at the thick stack of paper bearing the county clerk's seal. Then he chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound. He wiped his mouth with a cloth, napkin, pushed his chair back, and walked over to his briefcase resting on the sideboard. He did not look angry or defeated. He looked at me with a mild, condescending pity. He unzipped the leather compartment and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it over my deed. It was a standard Arizona residential lease agreement. I scanned the terms printed on the page. 10 years. Fixed rent. $1 a month. The tenant listed was Chloe. The signature at the bottom belonged to my father, acting as the authorized property manager. My own legal mechanism, designed to save his pride, was staring back at me. He had weaponized the power of attorney I gave him 4 years ago. Chloe leaned forward, resting her hands on her stomach. She was 3 months pregnant, a detail she had announced at Thanksgiving by hiding an ultrasound picture in the gravy boat. She genuinely did not view this lease as a hostile takeover. In her mind, the familial hierarchy was set in stone. I was 34, single, and spent my evenings reviewing medical actuarial tables. I lived a quiet, structured life. Chloe, on the other hand, was building a family with Greg, a man who rotated through startup ideas like seasonal weather. Because I had the steady income and the quiet disposition, my parents viewed my financial stability as a natural resource. It was meant to be harvested for the benefit of the collective. She tilted her head, giving me a soft, sympathetic smile. "You have to be reasonable, Emily," she said. "Greg and I need a proper nursery. You just have your cat and your laptop. You can't easily downsize to a studio apartment downtown. It makes 0 sense for one person to hoard a 2-bedroom unit when the baby is coming." The casual use of the word hoard shifted something cold in my chest. My parents nodded in unison. My father added that family makes sacrifices for family. The implication hung heavy in the dining room. I was the designated safety net, woven solely to catch them whenever they decided to jump. The consequences of my long-held secrecy hit me like a physical blow. I packed my bag, left the dinner table, and drove straight to the local police precinct. I thought I could stand at the front desk and report a fraudulent lease. The desk sergeant was polite but dismissive. He looked at the paperwork and shook his head. He explained this was strictly a civil matter. My father possessed the legal authority to sign leases on behalf of my limited liability company. The fact that the terms were heavily skewed did not make it a criminal trespass. Ownership does not grant you immediate physical possession. I could not simply change the locks on the doors. I could not turn off their water or electricity. If I tried, I would be the one arrested and charged with an illegal self-help eviction. I drove back to my building and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, staring up at the 6-unit complex I owned. I was legally trapped by my own misplaced empathy. First thing Monday morning, I sat in the austere office of a real estate attorney in downtown Phoenix. He reviewed the $1 lease and told me what I already dreaded. The power of attorney made the contract technically valid on its face. Breaking it required a formal eviction lawsuit filed in the Maricopa County Justice Court. I authorized the filing immediately. The process server delivered the 30-day notice to quit later that same week. I expected my parents to fold under the threat of a public court record. Instead, they doubled down and went on the offensive. My father viewed the eviction notice as an unforgivable personal insult. Rather than step down, he and my mother drained the last of their meager retirement savings and hired a notoriously stubborn tenant defense lawyer. Their legal strategy was brilliant and suffocating. They filed a countersuit claiming sweat equity. My father argued that his unpaid labor as the property manager, repairing leaky faucets and painting hallways, constituted a verbal contract for partial ownership of the building itself. His lawyer produced hundreds of handwritten invoices for arbitrary maintenance tasks. These were tasks I had already paid licensed professionals to handle, but my father had forged dates and hours to create a paper trail of his supposed labor. They were intentionally muddying the waters, dragging the clear-cut eviction into a prolonged, expensive discovery phase. The initial court date was pushed back by months. Mountainous legal fees loomed ahead of me, threatening to drain my own savings. While the lawyers traded formal filings across town, the physical reality of my daily living situation rapidly deteriorated. Chloe and Greg did not wait for a judge to rule on their residency. They began treating the entire building as their personal domain. Greg started parking his oversized lifted truck in my designated covered parking spot, forcing me to park on the street blocks away. Chloe began moving her overflow furniture into the shared hallway right outside my front door. Every evening I came home from a demanding 10-hour shift analyzing medical risks, only to navigate a maze of unassembled crib boxes, stacked dining chairs, and baby shower gifts piled against my wall. I could hear them inside the adjacent unit, measuring the walls, and talking loudly about knocking down the partition to create an open-concept living space. They were planning renovations on a property they did not own. The very morning after that Sunday dinner, I had marched into the bank and legally revoked my father's access to the property management accounts. I fired him as the manager immediately. But I was too late. When the teller printed the balance sheet, I saw that the maintenance fund had been aggressively drained over the last 2 years. The money I thought was safely accumulating was gone. Because the building accounts were empty, the substantial monthly mortgage payments were now drawing directly from my personal checking account. My father knew he had no real legal claim with his sweat equity lawsuit. It was purely a delay tactic. He was using the notoriously slow Arizona civil court system to bleed my personal savings dry, hoping I would go bankrupt before a judge could physically order their eviction. The sensory invasion was constant. I had to listen to the scraping of heavy chairs, the loud late-night laughter, and the entitled planning happening just on the other side of my drywall. The tension became a physical weight pressing against my chest every time I put my key in the lock. They thought they could wear my patience down. They thought the constant noise, the mounting legal bills, and the sheer awkwardness of our forced proximity would break my resolve. They assumed I would eventually offer them a lucrative cash settlement just to make them leave me in peace. Sitting in my living room, listening to Greg hammer a nail into my adjoining wall, I realized that reacting emotionally was a losing strategy. Playing defense would only prolong the siege. I needed to stop fighting them like a wounded daughter and start dismantling their foundation like a clinical auditor. I opened my laptop, accessed the secure banking portal, and began pulling the transaction history for the property management account over the last 48 months. The following 12 weeks were an exercise in brutal attrition. While my father stalled the legal proceedings, my mother orchestrated a masterful public relations campaign. She weaponized her neighborhood watch and Bible study group, framing the eviction as a calculated attack on an unborn child. To the outside world, I was the corporate villain. Extended relatives muted my profiles, and the local pharmacy cashier started handing me my receipts in stiff silence. Inside the building, the psychological pressure was even worse. I dropped 15 pounds listening to the constant thumping of Greg's renovations and the loud, entitled laughter of my family next door. The siege peaked one rainy Tuesday. Sitting in my dark kitchen, listening to them celebrate a prenatal appointment in a home I was funding, the heavy knot of self-doubt finally tightened. I opened my laptop and typed a message to my lawyer asking if we should just offer them a cash payout to end the hostility. My finger hovered over the send button. The cursor blinked against the white screen, reflecting my hesitation. I looked around the quiet room, and my eyes landed on a stack of risk assessment files from my office sitting on the kitchen counter. I stood up, walked over, and pressed my hand flat against the thick manila folders. The heavy paper felt solid and real. Inside those folders were complex data sets I dissected daily, to separate false claims from empirical evidence. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about neighborhood gossip or a mother's performative tears. I realized in that exact moment that engaging with her emotional warfare was a trap. Arguing about who deserved love or space would only feed her narrative. I needed a different battleground. My father had claimed sweat equity and partial ownership based on his labor as the property manager. To win his legal argument, he had to prove his financial stewardship of the building was flawless. I knew my father. He was a man who financed luxury cars while drowning in credit card debt. His financial stewardship had never been flawless. It was always a house of cards, waiting for a strong breeze. I realized the evidence to dismantle his defense was not hidden in text messages or angry voicemails. It was buried in the arithmetic. I needed cold numbers to fight her warm tears. The more they pushed the false story in public, the more determined I became to uncover the private reality. I retreated into my analytical mindset. The next morning I requested a personal day from work. I did not drive to the courthouse or confront my family. I drove to a nondescript office park on the outskirts of Scottsdale and walked into the firm of a certified forensic accountant. His name was David. He did not ask about my feelings or my childhood. He asked for bank statements, routing numbers, and access to the limited liability company ledgers. I handed him a portable hard drive containing 4 years of digital records corresponding to the property management account. I also provided the original lease agreements for the other 4 units in the complex. The ensuing weeks presented a stark contrast in tactics. Next door, my sister continued her loud performative nesting. I could hear the rhythmic thumping of hammers as Greg attempted to install custom shelving for the nursery. I heard the sharp whine of power drills cutting through drywall as they made unapproved modifications. Their side of the duplex was a theater of chaotic entitlement. They invited friends over for weekend brunches, speaking loudly on the shared patio about paint colors and lighting fixtures. My side remained enveloped in silence. There were no arguments in the driveway. There were no pleading phone calls to my mother begging her to stop the rumors. My retaliation consisted solely of secure encrypted emails arriving from David's office. The tension shifted from the loud physical space of the hallway to the quiet, deliberate turning of spreadsheet pages. I spent my evenings reviewing the initial findings, highlighting discrepancies with a yellow marker, while the sound of their television bled through the wall. David worked backwards, starting from the current month and tracing every outgoing cent. He cross-referenced the building maintenance account with the standard market rates for regional repairs in Maricopa County. The discrepancies surfaced almost immediately. Initially, the irregularities appeared minor and easy to overlook. A missing receipt here, a slightly inflated invoice for plumbing supplies there. It looked like sloppy bookkeeping rather than theft. But as the audit plunged deeper into the prior years, navigating through hundreds of transactions, the pattern hardened into undeniable proof. My father had not simply been mismanaging the funds due to incompetence. He had been executing a sustained, deliberate operation to siphon money from the property. He had created a secondary ledger system to hide the missing capital. The detailed report arrived on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my dining table, the sound of distant thunder rumbling outside, and read the cold facts. My father had been collecting the standard security deposits from the 4 unrelated tenants in the building. Arizona law requires those funds to be held in a separate trust account, untouched by the property manager. Instead, he had diverted them into a shadow account under a slightly different spelling of his name. He had forged invoices from non-existent landscaping companies and phantom electrical contractors, paying those fictitious entities directly. The money trail did not vanish into thin air. David had traced the routing numbers using public records and bank identification codes. The stolen security deposits had paid the initial holding fee for Chloe's wedding venue. The inflated plumbing invoices had covered the monthly installments on Greg's lease truck. The roofing repair fund that was supposed to protect the building had been drained to pay for their honeymoon flights. The ledger revealed the true architecture of my family's dynamics. They had not just taken my kindness for granted. My father had treated the other tenants' money as a slush fund to finance the golden child's lifestyle. He had committed systemic embezzlement, using my corporate entity as his shield. The countersuit claiming sweat equity was not just a legal stalling tactic. It was a desperate maneuver to prevent me from looking closely at the books during the discovery phase of the trial. The quiet realization washed over me, bringing a strange sense of calm. The fear and guilt that had weighed me down for months evaporated into the dry desert air. I did not need to win back my relatives or convince my mother to love me. I just needed to show them the math. The narrative had shifted from a civil dispute over a lease to documented financial fraud. My father thought he was playing chess with a heartbroken daughter. He was about to find out he was sitting across from a clinical auditor holding a royal flush. The trap they built for me had just become there. The climax of my structural collapse did not happen at a dramatic holiday gathering or a tearful intervention. It took place on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Phoenix, inside a sterile fluorescent-lit mediation room. It was a Tuesday morning. The air conditioning hummed a low monotone note. Across the polished mahogany table sat my father Richard, my mother Susan, and my sister Chloe. Next to them was their tenant defense attorney, looking incredibly pleased with himself. They arrived wearing the relaxed expressions of people who believed they had already won a war of attrition. Chloe rested her hands over her prominent stomach, sighing heavily to communicate her physical discomfort to the retired judge acting as our mediator. My mother arranged her posture into a picture of maternal sorrow. She offered me a tight, strained smile across the distance, playing the role of the victimized matriarch forced into legal proceedings by her corporate daughter. Their lawyer opened his briefcase with a crisp snap. He spent the first 20 minutes outlining their proposed resolution. It was exactly what I had anticipated. He suggested that in the interest of family harmony, and to avoid the mounting costs of a prolonged trial, I should write a check for $40,000. This sum, he argued, would serve as a buyout for the remaining years on Chloe's $1-a-month lease and compensate my father for his alleged sweat equity. They wanted me to purchase my own property back from them, using the money they assumed I was desperate to keep. I sat perfectly still. I did not interrupt him. I let him build his fragile house of cards until he finally leaned back and folded his hands. The mediator turned to my side of the table, asking if I had a counteroffer. I looked at my legal counsel, Mr. Caldwell. He did not say a word. He simply reached into his leather bag and produced 2 heavy, identical navy blue binders. The sound of those binders hitting the table echoed in the quiet room like a gavel strike. Caldwell slid the first binder across the polished wood, stopping inches from my father's hands. I told my father to open it. He hesitated, then flipped the heavy plastic cover. Inside was a standard voluntary lease termination agreement and a quitclaim deed. It required both his signature and Chloe's, relinquishing any and all physical or financial claims to my 6-unit complex. Their attorney chuckled a dry, dismissive sound. He stated there was zero incentive for his clients to sign away their leverage without financial compensation. I ignored the lawyer and kept my gaze fixed squarely on my father. Caldwell slid the second binder forward. I told Richard to look at page 4. His hands moved slower this time. He turned the pages. The second binder contained the unredacted forensic accounting report David had finalized. It held side-by-side columns of the property management trust account and the secondary shadow ledger my father had secretly maintained. It contained bank routing, numbers, printed copies of forged maintenance invoices from non-existent landscaping companies, and corresponding transaction dates showing the stolen security deposits funneling directly into the venue holding fee for Chloe's wedding. The room grew profoundly quiet. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly felt deafening. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I explained the arithmetic to the room. I stated that the building maintenance account was missing roughly $38,000. I detailed how the funds meant for emergency roof repairs were diverted to cover Greg's truck lease. I pointed out the exact date my father authorized a fraudulent electrical repair invoice to purchase 2 first-class tickets to Hawaii for Chloe's honeymoon. I watched my father's chest stop moving. He was holding his breath. I did not gloat. I felt no surge of triumph. I only felt the cold, heavy reality of my ledger. I offered him the final calculation. I told him he had a choice to make right now before anyone left this room. He could sign the documents in the first binder, voiding the fraudulent 10-year lease, and agreeing to vacate the premises within 30 days. If he did that, the second binder would go into a shredder, and I would swallow the financial loss of the stolen funds. Alternatively, he could refuse. If he refused, Caldwell was instructed to immediately file the contents of the second binder, along with a drafted criminal complaint, to the Maricopa County District Attorney for felony embezzlement and wire fraud. Their defense attorney pulled the second binder toward him, scanning the bank routing numbers and the forged signatures. The smug satisfaction drained from his face, replaced by the sharp professional realization that his client had lied to him. He whispered something urgent into my father's ear. Chloe looked back and forth between the two men. Her foundational belief in her own entitlement rested entirely on her father's authority. She demanded to know what was in the second binder. She asked my father to explain why he was suddenly pale and shaking. Richard could not look at his favorite daughter. He could not look at his wife, who was staring at the forged invoices with a dawning horror. The narrative she had spun to her neighborhood watch and her church group was collapsing in real time. Her husband had not been protecting their family. He had been stealing from innocent tenants and committing financial crimes to fund an illusion of prosperity. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Finally, my father reached for the metal pen resting in the center of the table. His hand trembled as he signed his name on the lease termination agreement. He passed the pen to Chloe. She was crying now, genuine tears of confusion and fear, but her father offered no defense. He just nodded once. She signed. They handed the documents back to Caldwell. We stood up. I did not offer a parting word of closure. There was no tearful apology or sudden moment of familial reconciliation. They gathered their belongings and walked out the glass doors, leaving a bitter unspoken wreckage behind them. True to the agreement, they moved out 3 weeks later in the dead of night. I won my building back and secured my financial future, but the victory required a heavy toll. The cost of my peace was the permanent severance of my bloodline. Now I walk the halls of a structure that belongs solely to me. It is calm and exceptionally quiet. I learned the only lesson that matters. Some foundations are so deeply rotten from within that the only logical choice is to tear them down and build something new completely by yourself.